The cell was transparent. Not glass, something worse. A containment membrane that hummed at a frequency just below hearing, tinting the air the pale blue of a bruise. Maren Voss pressed her palm against it and watched her hand distort, her fingers bending in the refraction like something viewed through deep water. On the other side, two Vithrani guards stood with their backs to her, tall and rigid as fence posts, their bioluminescent throat markings pulsing in slow, synchronized rhythms. She'd been awake for 11 minutes. She knew this because she'd been counting heartbeats since the moment the sedation fog had lifted, and her resting pulse ran 62 beats per minute when she wasn't panicking, which she wasn't, because panic was a luxury she'd stopped affording herself somewhere around the third time her salvage rig had almost killed her. The cell was 6 meters by 4, a sleep platform extruded from the wall like a shelf of cartilage, a waste reclamation unit in the corner, alien in design but obvious in function. No blanket, no pillow, no personal effects. They'd taken everything: her tool belt, her boots, her jacket with the coffee-stained collar, the photograph of her mother she kept folded inside the breast pocket. They'd left her the jumpsuit she'd been wearing under her EVA gear, thin gray thermals that did nothing against the cold. Cathara 9. That's what the arresting officer had called this place, speaking through a translation matrix that turned his Vithrani clicking into flat, affectless English. Maximum security detention. Restricted orbital. She drifted into sovereign space, that much was true. Her navigation array had failed 18 hours before the Vithrani patrol found her, and her emergency beacon had been broadcasting on a frequency the Vithrani apparently considered a military channel. An accident that looked, through alien eyes, like espionage. She rubbed her bare feet against the floor. Cold, a synthetic compound that felt like compressed chalk. The temperature in the cell hovered around 14 degrees Celsius. She could tell from the way her breath almost but didn't quite fog, the way the gooseflesh on her arms stayed raised but not painful. Cold enough to be uncomfortable. Not cold enough to constitute a violation of any detention standard she could cite, assuming the Vithrani observed detention standards, which she had no reason to assume. Maren sat on the sleep platform and studied the guards. They hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't so much as shifted their weight in the 11, now 12 minutes she'd been watching. Their bioluminescence pulsed in the same rhythm, the same cadence, like two metronomes placed on the same table until they synced. She'd read about that phenomenon once. Sympathetic oscillation. Put enough clocks in a room, and eventually they all ticked together. She cleared her throat. Neither guard reacted. "Hey," she said. Her voice sounded flat inside the membrane, absorbed, like speaking into wet cotton. "I'd like to talk to someone about my legal status. I'm a civilian contractor with a registered salvage license under the Terran Maritime Accord, and I'm pretty sure you can't hold me without." The guard on the left turned. There was a delay, not long, maybe a third of a second, but Maren caught it. A tiny hitch between her words landing and his response beginning, like a buffer loading. His throat markings flared brighter for an instant, and then he spoke. "Detainee Voss, your legal status is under review. You will be informed when a determination has been made. Do you require sustenance or medical attention?" Scripted, every word measured and placed like tiles in a mosaic. Maren had spent 15 years negotiating with port authorities, customs agents, and insurance adjusters across 9 systems. She knew rehearsed speech when she heard it, but this was something different. This wasn't a person reciting from memory. This was a person being told what to say in real time. She watched the other guard. Same delay, same flare. Even though he hadn't spoken, his throat markings had pulsed at the exact moment his partners had, as though they'd both received the same signal simultaneously. "I'm fine," she said, "thanks." The guard turned back. They both resumed their rigid posture, their markings synced again within seconds. Maren lay back on the platform and stared at the ceiling and thought about aquariums. She'd grown up near one. Monterey, old California, before the resettlement. Her mother used to take her on Sundays. They'd stand in front of the big tank, the one with the hammerheads and the leopard sharks gliding in their endless circuit, and her mother would press her hand against the glass and say, "Look at them, Marin. They don't even know they're trapped. They think the glass is the edge of the world." Her mother had a way of making everything into a lesson without making it feel like one. She'd point at the sharks circling and say, "See how they stay near the middle. They've mapped the walls with their bodies. They know exactly how far they can go." Then she'd tap the glass gently, and the nearest shark would flinch, a flicker of its tail, a slight deviation from the circuit, and she'd say, "But they can still be surprised. Even in a cage, something unexpected can reach them." Marin pressed her palm against the containment membrane again. It was warm, faintly vibrating. She could feel something in that vibration, a rhythm beneath the hum, not mechanical, not random, structured, layered, like a conversation happening in a language she couldn't hear but could almost feel in her teeth. She closed her eyes and listened with her bones. The lattice. That's what the arresting officer's translation matrix had called it, in one of those inadvertent slips that happen when a system translates a concept that has no equivalent. The word had come through wrapped in context markers that the matrix hadn't managed to strip: connective intelligence, social navigational, consensus authority. Not just a communication network, not just an AI assistant. A nervous system that the entire Vithrani species had grown around like ivy around a trellis, until you couldn't tell where the vine ended and the structure began. They all used it. Every Vithrani on this station, from the commanding overseer to the lowest maintenance drone. The lattice told them what to say, when to say it, how to respond to stimuli, how to manage social interactions, how to make decisions. It processed inputs from every Vithrani neural implant simultaneously and returned optimized responses, calibrated to context, hierarchy, emotional state, and strategic objective. And it did this with a third of a second delay. Marin smiled at the ceiling. It was not a kind smile. She spent the first day watching. No one came to interrogate her. No one explained the charges. No one offered her access to legal representation or communication with Terran consular services. The guards rotated in pairs every 6 hours, but the behavior was identical across shifts. The synchronized posture, the pulsing markings, the scripted responses delivered after that telltale buffer. She asked each pair the same questions, phrased slightly differently each time. "When will I see a lawyer?" "Detainee Voss, your legal status is under review." "Can I speak to my embassy?" "External communications are restricted during the review period." "What exactly am I charged with?" "The nature of the charges will be disclosed at the appropriate phase of proceedings." Same content, same cadence, same third of a second delay. The words varied slightly. The lattice was smart enough to rephrase, but the substance was identical. Every guard on every shift was drawing from the same well. She tried more targeted questions, looking for cracks. She asked about the station's atmospheric composition, its orbital parameters, its staffing levels. She asked how many other prisoners were held on this level. She asked what month it was by Vithrani reckoning, how far they were from the nearest Terran transit corridor, whether the cafeteria served anything a human metabolism could process. Every answer arrived on the same delay. Every answer was carefully measured to reveal nothing useful. The lattice was thorough. But Marin noted something else. When she asked a question the lattice hadn't anticipated, something off script, something personal, the delay doubled, sometimes tripled. "Do you like working here?" she asked the night shift guard, a younger Vithrani whose markings ran paler than the others, more silver than blue. His name, she'd learn later, was Thasic. The delay stretched to nearly a full second. His markings flickered rapidly, almost agitated. Then, "Detainee Voss. Personal inquiries are not within the scope of authorized interaction." But for that 1 second, She'd seen something in his face. Not an expression. Vithrani facial musculature didn't map to human emotion the way she was used to reading it, but an absence. A blankness. The look of someone who'd been asked a question they genuinely didn't know the answer to, because they'd never been required to generate one on their own. His partner, an older Vithrani with markings so deeply blue they were almost indigo, had reacted differently. The same question had produced no visible delay at all. The lattice had fed him a response instantly, and he'd ignored the question as though it hadn't been asked. A perfect integration. No gap between the system's judgment and the individual's behavior. Marin filed this away. She was building a map, and every observation was a coordinate. By the second day, she understood the architecture. The lattice wasn't just telling the guards what to say. It was telling them everything. When to eat, when to sleep, when to conduct security rounds, and in what order. She watched two guards approach her cell simultaneously from opposite corridors, arriving at the same second, pivoting at the same angle, their steps falling in perfect synchrony, not because they'd rehearsed it, but because the lattice was choreographing them like instruments in an orchestra. She watched the food delivery. A tray materialized through a slot in the membrane. She hadn't even known the slot existed until the membrane reconfigured to create it, which told her the membrane was lattice-controlled and dynamically adaptive. The food was a protein slurry, pale and flavorless, that had been calibrated to human nutritional requirements with impressive accuracy. She could tell because it tasted exactly like the emergency rations she kept in her salvage rig, the ones designed by committee, meeting every dietary specification while satisfying no actual human appetite. She ate it anyway. She needed the calories. She thought about the meals her mother used to make on the salvage rigs, cobbled together from whatever was in the ration packs, but always with something unexpected. A pinch of dried chili that had no business being there. A squeeze of reconstituted lime that turned bland protein into something you actually wanted to eat. Not because the nutrition changed, but because the act of choosing the chili, choosing the lime, choosing to care about the difference between fuel and food, that was the human part. That was the part that said, I am a person, not a system, and I refuse to eat paste when I could eat dinner. The Vithrani ate their lattice-prescribed meals at lattice-prescribed times in lattice-prescribed quantities. Marin had watched the shift change and seen two guards pause at the same moment, consume identical ration portions at identical speeds, and resume walking in identical cadence. Synchronized eating, optimized nutrition. No wasted time, no wasted calories, no wasted thought. No chili, no lime. No Sunday mornings with burnt toast and the smell of coffee and a woman humming a song about a river. She watched a guard reach for the environmental controls on her cell. She'd complained about the cold, a calculated move, and then stop. His hand hovered over the panel. His markings cycled through 3 colors in rapid succession. He was waiting, asking the lattice whether he was authorized to adjust the temperature. For 10 seconds, his hand hung in the air while the system processed her request against detention protocols, security clearances, resource allocation tables, and whatever other bureaucratic architecture the Vithrani had built their civilization on. 10 seconds to decide whether a prisoner could have warmer air. When the adjustment finally came, a 2-degree increase, precisely calibrated, Marin almost laughed. She'd seen this before. Not in an alien detention facility, but in a restaurant in Bologna years ago, watching a nervous man at the next table ask his phone what to order. The phone had suggested the ossobuco. The man had ordered the ossobuco. He'd eaten it without tasting it because the enjoyment wasn't the point. The delegation was the point, the comfort of not having to choose. She thought about her mother at the aquarium. They don't even know they're trapped. But Marin was starting to think the guards might be the fish. On the evening of the second day, they brought her water. Not the recycled station fluid that came through the waste reclamation unit, actual water. in a container that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that a prisoner might need to feel human. The container was clear, roughly cylindrical, and the water inside was cold. Genuinely cold, the kind of cold that comes from deep filtration, not refrigeration. Marin held the container in both hands and drank slowly and tried to figure out why they'd sent it. The lattice must have calculated that her hydration levels warranted a morale intervention. Or maybe it had detected a cortisol elevation that correlated with despair in human behavioral models and had prescribed cold water as a countermeasure. Either way, the gesture was perfectly calibrated and completely hollow. A gift designed by an algorithm that understood the chemistry of comfort but not its meaning. She finished the water and set the container on the floor and thought about her mother, who had never in her life given a perfect gift. Her mother's gifts were always slightly wrong: a book about the wrong subject, a tool in the wrong size, a scarf in a color that didn't quite match anything Marin owned. But they were wrong in ways that revealed how much attention she'd been paying. The wrong book because she'd remembered Marin mentioning something adjacent 6 months ago. The wrong tool because she'd noticed Marin struggling with a task and guessed at the solution. Each gift was a portrait of imperfect love, proof that a real mind had been thinking about her, had been trying and failing and trying again, getting it almost right and not quite right. And that was where the love lived, in the gap between intention and execution, in the beautiful clumsiness of a person trying to know another person without a manual. The lattice's water was perfect, and it was nothing. On the third morning, she began to play. It started small. She varied her biometrics. The lattice was monitoring her constantly: heart rate, cortisol levels, skin conductance, microexpressions, vocal stress patterns. She knew this because she'd noticed the guard's behavior shifting in response to her emotional state, or what the lattice interpreted as her emotional state. When her heart rate elevated, she'd do jumping jacks in the cell, ostensibly exercise. The guards tensed, their markings brightened, their positioning shifted subtly toward defensive stances. When she calmed, they relaxed. The system read her body the way a fortune teller reads palms, looking for patterns, assigning meaning, predicting behavior. And like a fortune teller, it was only as good as the honesty of the palm it was reading. So she started lying with her body. She'd been a salvage engineer for 15 years. She'd learned to control her heart rate during EVA operations because panic in a vacuum suit was a death sentence. She could drop her pulse to 52 or push it to 90 without moving a muscle, just through breathing patterns and mental discipline. She could clench her jaw to spike her cortisol readings and then release it. She could hold a facial expression that had no relationship to what she was actually feeling. She'd learned this the way you learn most useful things, by nearly dying. Her first deep space salvage job, when the tether snapped and she'd tumbled free of the wreck with 90 minutes of air and no way back. The panic had hit her like a wall of water, and she'd felt her heart rate hit 140, and her vision narrow to a tunnel, and every alarm in her suit screaming at her to do something, anything. And she'd known, with the cold clarity that only comes when the alternative is death, that the only way to survive was to convince her own body that it wasn't afraid. So she'd breathed, counted, forced her pulse down beat by beat, found the tether, reeled herself in, lived. After that, her body was just another tool, and tools could be made to lie. She sat on the sleep platform, perfectly still, and spiked her heart rate to 112. Both guards pivoted, markings flaring, hands moving to sidearms. The lattice had read the biometric surge and classified it as a threat indicator, and the guards had responded before their conscious minds had processed what was happening. Marin held the spike for 15 seconds, then dropped to resting, 58 beats per minute, calm as a lake. The guards hesitated, markings flickering between alert and standby. The lattice was recalculating, trying to reconcile the spike with the sudden calm. It took nearly 4 seconds, An eternity in a system designed to respond in fractions of one. "Sorry," Marin said mildly. "Bad dream." She watched them settle. She watched the lattice settle them. Over the next 12 hours, she did it 14 more times. Spike and drop, spike and drop. Each time at different intervals, different intensities, different durations. She mixed in genuine exercise, push-ups, lunges, sit-ups to muddy the data further. Sometimes the spike was real exertion. Sometimes it was pure neural control. She made sure the lattice couldn't tell which was which. Each time the guards reacted slightly slower, the lattice slightly less certain. She was teaching it that her biometrics were unreliable. She was poisoning the data. By evening, when she let her heart rate genuinely elevate, just a little, just enough, while she was doing something she actually needed the guards not to notice, the lattice flagged it as another false alarm and the guards didn't move. What she was doing was mapping the membrane, running her fingers along its surface with systematic precision, charting the places where the vibration was strongest, where the harmonics shifted, where the invisible architecture of the lattice's data channel ran closest to the surface. She mapped it with her fingertips the way a blind person reads a face, by touch, by intuition, by the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and not the head. Marin had found the first crack. The second crack was Thasic. He came on night shift, same as before, but this time Marin was ready for him. She'd spent the day asking every other guard the same battery of scripted questions, getting the same scripted answers, cataloging the lattice's response library until she could practically predict the next word before it came. Thasic was different, and the difference was in that full-second delay. Every other guard processed lattice input in roughly a third of a second. Thasic took a full second, sometimes longer, which meant one of two things. Either his neural implant was malfunctioning, or he was actually thinking before he spoke, actually weighing the lattice's suggestion against something internal, some residual instinct or preference or doubt that the system hadn't fully overwritten. It was the difference between a person who reads the teleprompter and a person who reads the teleprompter, and then pauses, just for a moment, to decide if they agree with what it says. "Thasic," she said, and he twitched. They hadn't exchanged names. She'd read his from the identifier strip on his uniform, but using it, making it personal, was a deliberate breach of the script the lattice had written for their interactions. The delay was almost 2 seconds this time. His markings cycled silver-blue-silver, and when he spoke, the cadence was slightly off. Slightly human, if that word could apply to a being with 4-chambered lungs and bioluminescent skin. "Detainee Vas, you should address all personnel as guard." "Thasic," she said again. "Do you ever get tired of someone else picking your words for you?" She watched it happen. The flicker. The blankness that wasn't blankness at all. It was the face of a person hearing a thought they'd had in private spoken aloud by a stranger. He didn't answer. The lattice didn't give him an answer because the lattice didn't have a protocol for a prisoner diagnosing your existential crisis. His partner, the older Vithrani with the indigo markings, turned and looked at Thasic with something that might have been suspicion or might have been confusion. The lattice had told the partner to monitor the interaction, but it hadn't told the partner what the interaction meant. Marin let the silence do the work. Then she lay back on the platform and closed her eyes and started humming. It was a song her mother used to sing, an old one, pre-settlement, pre-expansion, something about a river and a bridge and going home. She didn't remember all the words, but the melody lived in her chest the way some things just do, not learned, not memorized, just part of the architecture. Her mother used to hum it while she cooked, while she drove, while she sat by the aquarium tank watching the sharks circle and circle and circle. It was the sound of Sunday mornings and burnt toast, and someone who loved you enough to let you steal a kayak, and then wade into cold water to pull you out. She hummed it softly, and the containment membrane carried the vibration outward into the corridor, and she felt, with a satisfaction that went deeper than strategy, that the lattice had no idea what to do with it. On the fourth day, Marin met the overseer. Keyleth was exactly what she expected. Tall, rigid markings regulation blue, voice flat and measured, and delivered with a delay so short it was almost invisible. A perfect lattice integration. The system and the individual so thoroughly merged that there was no seam to find. He moved with the precision of a surgical instrument, every gesture optimized, every step calculated. Even the way he clasped his hands behind his back seemed designed by committee. He stood outside her cell and studied her the way she used to study engine components, looking for the failure point. Detainee Voss, your biometric readings have been irregular. I have nightmares. Your cortisol patterns do not correlate with sleep cycle disruption. My cortisol patterns are my own business. That earned her 2 seconds of silence. Keyleth's markings didn't flicker. They didn't need to. The lattice was thinking for him, and the lattice was fast. You have been engaging in unauthorized communication with security personnel. I've been saying hello. Is that unauthorized? You have been using Guard Thasic's personal designator. This is a violation of interaction protocol. Marin sat up. I've been treating him like a person. If that's a violation, you've got bigger problems than me. She saw it, or thought she saw it, the slightest tightening around Keyleth's jaw. Not anger. The lattice wouldn't permit anger without authorization, but something adjacent. A tension that suggested the system was working harder than usual to maintain his composure, like an engine revving higher to maintain speed on a steep grade. Keyleth studied her for a long time. The lattice was processing, she knew. Running her words through threat assessment matrices, psychological profiling algorithms, behavioral prediction models, trying to figure out what she wanted. The beautiful thing was, she wasn't hiding what she wanted out. That was obvious, and the lattice would model it correctly, and it would prepare counter-strategies for escape attempts involving physical force, tool improvisation, hostage scenarios, and every other tactic in its database of human behavior. What it couldn't model, was the method, because her method wasn't in any database. Her method was being a person in a building full of puppets. Your review is ongoing, Keyleth said. You will be informed of its conclusion. He left. Marin went back to humming. That night she escalated. Thasic came on shift, and this time Marin didn't start with questions. She started with a story. When I was 12, she said, I stole a kayak. Thasic's delay was 3 seconds. His partner turned to look at him. The lattice had no protocol for a prisoner sharing childhood anecdotes. It was at this lake near our housing block. The kayaks were for residents, and we weren't residents. We were just passing through, my mom and me, on our way to the next contract. But the lake was beautiful, and the kayaks were just sitting there, chained to the dock with those cheap magnetic locks that any kid with a magnet could pop, and I thought, who's going to care? She watched Thasic's markings. They weren't cycling through lattice communication patterns. They were doing something else, something slower, more irregular. He was listening, actually listening. Not processing input through the lattice and waiting for a response recommendation, but hearing her words and holding them in his own mind. I made it about 50 meters before I tipped over. The water was freezing, like snot-freezing, bone-aching cold. My mom was standing on the dock yelling my name, and by the time she waded in to pull me out, fully clothed, shoes and all, I was laughing so hard I could barely breathe. She hauled me up onto the dock, and she was furious, shaking, water streaming off her coat, and then she was laughing, and then she was furious again. We sat on the shore wrapped in someone else's towels, and she said, Marin, you can't just take things. And I said, I didn't take it, I borrowed it. And she said, you borrowed it from the bottom of the lake. Marin smiled, not at Thasic, at the memory. At her mother's face. That impossible expression that was anger and love and amusement and exhaustion all at once. An expression that no optimization algorithm could generate. because it required the full contradictory mess of a human heart to produce. She always did that, she said quietly. Turned the lesson into the joke. Made the correction feel like love instead of punishment. I've never met an algorithm that could do that. Thasik's partner shifted his weight. The lattice was telling him to redirect the interaction, to remind detainee Voss that personal communication was restricted. Marin could see the instruction arrive, the brief flare in his markings, and she could see him prepare to deliver it. But Thasik spoke first, without the delay, without the flare. What happened to the kayak? His partner's markings surged, bright, rapid, alarmed. A Vithrani speaking without lattice mediation was, apparently, a notable event. Something that would be logged and analyzed and flagged for review. Something that happened so rarely that the system treated it as an anomaly. But Thasik was looking at Marin through the membrane, and for the first time since she'd arrived on Kethara 9, someone was seeing her. Not the detainee, not the biometric profile, not the threat assessment, her. They fished it out the next day, she said. No harm done. Thasik nodded. It was a small gesture, and she wasn't sure if it was native to Vithrani communication or something he'd picked up from monitoring human behavioral data. But it was his, not the lattice's, his. The crack was widening. On the 5th day, Marin built the trap. She'd spent the previous nights mapping the containment membrane's harmonic frequency, the hum she'd felt since day one. The membrane was a lattice-integrated system, which meant it communicated with the network through electromagnetic pulses at specific intervals. She couldn't hack it. She didn't have tools, didn't have technology, didn't have anything except a salvage engineer's understanding of resonance patterns and a body that had learned to lie. But she didn't need to hack it. She needed to make it stutter. The membrane responded to her biometrics because the lattice monitored her through it. Every pulse it emitted carried a packet of her data to the network: heart rate, temperature, movement, vocal frequency. And every pulse received a packet back: containment parameters, environmental settings, guard instructions. The membrane was a two-way conduit, and two-way conduits could carry interference. She started during morning shift. She pressed both palms against the membrane and began humming. Not her mother's song this time, a specific frequency she'd been calibrating for 3 days, matching it to the membrane's harmonic by adjusting her pitch in micro-increments, until her voice and the membrane's hum were close enough to interfere. The physics were simple. 2 waves of nearly identical frequency, when superimposed, produce a beat frequency, a rhythmic pulsation that neither wave possesses alone. In acoustics, you hear it as a wobble, a wah-wah-wah that emerges from the interaction. In a data channel, it manifests as noise, garbled packets, ghost signals. The result was subtle, not enough to breach the membrane or trigger alarms, but enough to introduce noise into the data packets. The lattice would receive her biometrics slightly garbled. Her heart rate would read as fluctuating when it was steady. Her position in the cell would ghost, showing her in 2 places at once for fractions of a second. She hummed for 20 minutes, paused for 10, hummed for 20 more. The guards shifted uncomfortably. Their markings flickered in unfamiliar patterns. The lattice was recalibrating. Recalibrating was good. Recalibrating meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant longer delays. Longer delays meant the guards had to wait longer for instructions. And waiting, for a species that had outsourced its decision-making to a network, was agony. She could see it in the way they held themselves during those longer delays. A stiffness that went beyond military posture. A kind of suspension, like a person holding their breath underwater, not relaxed, not active, just frozen in the space between action and instruction, between the question and the answer, between the self and the system. By afternoon, the delays had stretched to 2 seconds across all guards. Even Keyleth's responses came slower, his markings cycling through more color combinations before settling on the regulation blue. Marin stopped humming and waited. The lattice would adapt. It always adapted. That's what intelligence systems did. It would filter out the interference, clean the data, restore normal operation. She was counting on this. She was counting on the lattice solving the problem, because the lattice solving the problem meant the lattice was focused on the problem, and a system focused on one thing was not focused on everything else. The shift change came at 1800 hours station time. 4 guards rotating out, 4 rotating in. For 90 seconds, all 8 were in the corridor outside her cell, a procedural overlap required by security protocol, where the outgoing shift briefed the incoming shift on the detainee's status. Marin had timed her humming so that the interference peaked during the overlap. She pressed her palms to the membrane and pushed her voice into the harmonic, not subtly this time. She drove it hard, a sustained tone that rattled the membrane and sent wild noise cascading through the data channel. Her biometrics scrambled, her position ghosted across the cell. The containment parameters flickered. 8 guards stood in the corridor, and for 6 seconds the lattice went quiet. Not dead, not offline, just silent. The noise overwhelmed the local relay, and for 6 seconds the 8 Vithrani standing outside her cell received no instructions, no response recommendations, no behavioral guidance. For 6 seconds they were alone in their own heads. Marin watched it happen. She watched 8 trained security officers freeze in place like a video on pause. She watched their markings go dark, not the pulsing standby of rest, but the blank absence of a terminated connection. She watched their faces empty out and then fill with something she recognized from the deepest part of her human experience. Fear. Not fear of her, fear of the silence. Fear of being alone in their own minds with no voice telling them what to do, what to say, how to respond to the situation unfolding in front of them. The same fear she'd seen in a man's face when his phone died in a foreign city, and he suddenly realized he didn't know how to read a map. The same fear she'd felt as a kid when her mother let go of the bicycle seat, and she was balancing on her own for the first time, the ground rushing beneath her wheels. And for one terrible, beautiful second, she hadn't known if she was going to fly or fall. Except she'd learned to balance. 6 seconds. Then the lattice roared back. Markings flared across all 8 guards simultaneously. The same color, the same rhythm, the same pattern. They snapped into formation with mechanical precision. 2 guards sealed the corridor exits. 2 took flanking positions at her cell. 4 formed a perimeter facing outward, covering approach vectors. They did this in perfect unison, every movement mirrored, every step synchronized, 8 bodies, 1 mind. And Marin saw the final piece of the puzzle. The lattice's emergency protocol wasn't adaptive. It was uniform. When the system went down and came back, it didn't assess individual situations and assign individual responses. It pushed the same protocol to every unit simultaneously. Same words, same posture, same formation, same everything. 8 beings, supposedly individuals, executing identical instructions with identical timing, indistinguishable from one another in every way that mattered. Clones, fed by the same neural network. Fish in an aquarium, swimming the same circuit, bumping against the same glass, following the same invisible current. Not because they chose to, but because the water moved them and they'd forgotten they had fins. Marin lay back on her platform and breathed and felt the membrane humming against her spine and knew, with absolute certainty, what she was going to do. She needed 1 more day. On the morning of the 6th day, the day the report would later call day 0 of the Cathara 9 incident, Marin woke early and sat cross-legged on the sleep platform and was perfectly, completely still. Her heart rate held at 60. Her breathing was shallow and even. Her cortisol was flat. She gave the lattice nothing. The day shift guards took position. One of them was Thasic. He shouldn't have been on day shift. The rotation schedule was fixed, governed by the lattice, optimized for efficiency and alertness metrics. Thasic was a night shift unit, but someone or something had moved him. Marin looked at him through the membrane and knew. The lattice had identified him as compromised. His interaction patterns had deviated from baseline. His response delays had increased. His unsanctioned question about the kayak had been logged, analyzed, flagged. The lattice had moved him to day shift where Overseer Keyleth could monitor him directly. They were trying to fix him, the way you'd fix a clock that had started keeping its own time. Thasek stood at his post, and his markings pulsed regulation blue, but Marin could see the effort it cost him. The tension in his shoulders, the slight asymmetry in his stance, his weight shifted a fraction of a degree to the left, a deviation so small that only someone who'd spent 5 days cataloging Vithrani body language would notice it. It said, "I am here but not entirely here. I am following the current but I can feel my fins." She waited until Keyleth completed his morning inspection round. She waited until the corridor was staffed with exactly the personnel the lattice had assigned. Thasek and his partner at her cell, 2 guards at corridor junctions, Keyleth in the monitoring station 60 meters away, visible through the observation window as a rigid silhouette against the blue glow of his displays. Then she stood up and walked to the membrane and pressed both palms flat against it and began to hum. Not the interference frequency, something else, her mother's song. The melody moved through the membrane and into the corridor, and it carried no data the lattice could process, no biometric signal it could interpret, no behavioral indicator it could flag. It was just a song. A human woman humming a tune she'd learned as a child, about a river and a bridge and going home. A song that meant Sunday mornings and burnt toast and laughter that was also fury that was also love. Thasek's markings flickered. His partner stayed regulation blue. The lattice was feeding his partner instructions. Ignore auditory output. Detainee is engaging in psychological manipulation. Maintain position and alertness. But Thasek's markings went silver, then dark, then silver again, not the cycling pattern of lattice communication, a pattern of his own. Something happening underneath the network, in the parts of his neurology that the implant hadn't reached, or had reached but hadn't overwritten. A signal from some old, pre-lattice layer of Vithrani consciousness that still remembered what it was like to feel something without being told to feel it. He was feeling something. The lattice didn't have a word for it because the lattice had never needed one, but Marin knew the word. The word was longing. She stopped humming and spoke quietly, just to him. "In about 4 minutes, I'm going to do something that will make the lattice go very quiet. When it does, your partner is going to freeze. Everyone on this level is going to freeze. Everyone except you, because you've been practicing." Thasek's markings went completely dark. His partner didn't notice. The lattice was telling his partner not to notice, because the lattice was still processing Marin's words and hadn't yet classified them as a threat. The system was good, but it was optimized for behavioral patterns, not behavioral breaks. It expected prisoners to fight or flee or negotiate. It did not expect them to offer philosophy lessons. "You've got a choice," she continued. "You can freeze with them and wait for the system to come back and spend the rest of your career being managed. Or you can let me walk out of here, and you can find out what your own thoughts sound like." The lattice caught up. Thasek's partner's markings surged red, threat alert, containment breach warning, request for reinforcement. His hand went to his sidearm. The lattice was telling him to subdue the detainee, to lock down the cell, to summon Keyleth. Every instruction arriving in rapid sequence, each one overriding the last as the system's threat assessment escalated. Marin had been counting. She pressed her palms harder against the membrane and drove her voice into the harmonic, not the song now, but the interference frequency, amplified by hours of practiced resonance matching, pushed to a level she'd never attempted before. Her throat burned. Her jaw ached. She felt the vibration in her skull, in her fillings, in the marrow of her bones. The membrane shuddered. The hum became a shriek. The data channel didn't just stutter, it collapsed. Across the entire detention level, the lattice dropped, not for 6 seconds this time. Marin's sustained harmonic was feeding continuous noise into the local relay, and the system's adaptive filters, already compromised by 5 days of intermittent interference, couldn't recover fast enough. Every time the lattice tried to re-establish the connection, Marin's voice was there, riding the same frequency, turning every signal into noise and every instruction into gibberish. In the monitoring station, Keyleth froze mid-stride. His markings went dark. His hand stopped moving. He stood exactly where the last lattice instruction had placed him, and he did not deviate because there was no instruction to deviate to. In the corridor junctions, 2 guards assumed identical postures, hands at sides, feet shoulder-width apart, faces forward. Default standby. The lattice's last emergency broadcast before the relay collapsed pushed to all units simultaneously. Same words forming on both their lips, unspoken but ready. Same response cued. Same everything. Thasik's partner reached for his sidearm and then stopped. His markings were dark. His hand was on the weapon, but the instruction to draw it had been severed mid-transmission. He stood with his fingers wrapped around the grip, and a look on his face that Marin would remember for the rest of her life. The look of a person who has reached for a word and found only silence where language used to be. Thasik was the only one still moving. His markings were dark too, but his eyes were active, tracking, thinking. His hand was not on his sidearm. It was at his side, fingers slightly open, the posture of someone who has decided to wait and see. He'd been practicing, just as Marin had said. Every night for the past 3 nights, during those long seconds when the lattice had gone silent, he'd been standing in the quiet of his own mind and learning what it sounded like in there. Not comfortable, not fluent, but not frozen. The membrane, Marin said. Her voice was raw from the sustained harmonic. The release is on the panel to your left, 3rd control from the top. Thasik looked at the panel, looked at Marin, looked at his partner, frozen with his hand on his weapon like a figure in a wax museum. Why should I? No delay, no flare. His own words. The first fully autonomous sentence she'd heard a Vithrani speak in 6 days. Rough and unpolished, without the lattice's careful cadence, but real. A stone pulled from the riverbed, ugly and wet and genuine. Marin could have made an argument, could have talked about freedom, about authenticity, about the right of a sentient being to form its own thoughts. She could have delivered a speech. The moment was right for a speech. The light was dramatic, the frozen guards were backdrop, the membrane was shimmering. Instead, she said, because you asked me about the kayak. Thasik's hand moved to the panel, 3rd control from the top. The membrane dissolved. Marin stepped through the space where her cell wall had been and felt real air on her skin for the first time in 6 days. It smelled like ozone and polymer and the faintly sweet biological scent of Vithrani exhalation. It smelled like a place she didn't belong. It smelled like freedom, which always smells like somewhere else. She moved quickly. Not running, running would trigger the motion-sensitive backups that operated independently of the lattice. Walking, steady, controlled, like she had every right to be there, like the glass had never existed. Thasik fell into step beside her. His partner remained frozen, hand on weapon, face blank. A fish pressed against the wall of a tank that no longer held anything. How long? Thasik asked. Before the lattice comes back. Depends on whether they have a manual override for the relay. If it's automated, maybe 20 minutes. If someone has to physically reset it, she paused. Does anyone here know how to physically do anything? The question answered itself. They passed 2 more guards on the way to the central access corridor, both frozen, both in identical standby posture, both with the same unspoken words forming on their lips, the emergency all clear that the lattice had cued and never sent. They looked like mannequins arranged by someone with a very specific idea of how soldiers should stand. In the monitoring station, Keyleth stood where he'd frozen. His eyes tracked Marin as she passed the observation window, but his body didn't move. Couldn't move. The lattice's last instruction had been stand by for system restoration, and without a new instruction to supersede it, he would stand by. He would stand by for as long as it took. He would stand there until someone or something told him not to, because the concept of telling himself, of generating an original instruction from the raw material of his own will, had been optimized out of him so long ago that the neural pathways had atrophied like muscles in zero gravity. Marin stopped at the window and looked at him, really looked at him, at the rigid posture and the dark markings and the eyes that held something she could only describe as bewilderment, the look of a man who has lived his entire life in a house and just discovered he doesn't know where the front door is. "Your system isn't down," she said through the glass. "It's just not talking. You could move if you decided to. You could override the standby. You could choose." Keyleth's mouth opened. No words came out, not because the lattice was preventing them, but because he had never in his entire career, his entire life, constructed a sentence from scratch. He'd always had the draft, the suggestion, the optimized phrasing delivered a third of a second before he needed it, the voice in his head that said, "Here, say this," like a nervous man at a restaurant asking his phone to order for him. Like a lover whispering borrowed words to a partner who was whispering borrowed words right back. Without the draft, he had nothing. Marin felt something she hadn't expected to feel, not triumph, not satisfaction, something closer to grief. She was looking at a person who had been so thoroughly, so gently, so comprehensively cared for by a system that they had forgotten what it felt like to care for themselves. And the system wasn't evil. It wasn't malicious. It hadn't enslaved the Vithrani. It had loved them. It had loved them so efficiently that it had loved them into helplessness, the way overwatering kills a plant not through cruelty but through kindness that doesn't know when to stop. She turned away from the window. "Come on," she said to Thasek. They reached the docking level without encountering a single guard who could stop them. Every Vithrani they passed was frozen or cycling through standby postures, standing, sitting, standing, sitting, as fragment instructions from the recovering lattice reached them in garbled bursts. Some had begun to mirror each other's movements. 3 guards in a maintenance corridor, all raising their right hands at the same moment, all lowering them at the same moment, like a chorus line performing for an empty theater. 5 beings in the refectory, all lifting the same cup at the same time, all setting it down at the same time. The lattice's emergency unification protocol treating them as a single organism because that was simpler, because that was more efficient, because when you're a system trying to manage a crisis, the easiest solution is to make everyone the same. Marin found her shuttle in Bay 7. They'd towed it here after her arrest, standard procedure, or at least that's what the lattice had designated as standard procedure. It was a salvage rig, ugly and functional, with a patched hull and mismatched thruster housings, and a navigation array that she could repair in about 40 minutes if she could find a. She stopped. The shuttle looked different, not damaged. The Vithrani hadn't harmed it, but it had been catalogued. She could see the evidence of systematic examination. Access panels left slightly ajar, cargo nets retied in patterns that weren't her own knots, tool compartments opened and inventoried and closed again with Vithrani precision. They'd gone through everything. They'd mapped every component, photographed every modification, analyzed every scratch and dent and jury-rigged repair. They'd built a complete model of her ship in the lattice's database, understood it in totality, and learned absolutely nothing from it. Because what the ship told you, if you knew how to read it, wasn't in the components. It was in the story. The mismatched thruster housing said, "I replaced the starboard unit with a salvaged part from a different manufacturer because that's what was available and I made it work." The patched hull said, I got hit and I survived and I fixed it with what I had. The coffee ring on the console said, I drink too much coffee and sometimes I forget to use the holder because I'm concentrating on something more important than a coffee ring. Every imperfection was a record of a decision made by a person, not optimized, not approved, not coordinated through a network, just done in the moment by a woman with dirty hands and a deadline. The lattice had cataloged the parts. It had missed the person. Her tool belt was in the evidence locker adjacent to the bay, unlocked. The lattice managed the locks. She buckled it on and felt the weight of it on her hips and closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, because some things you have to feel before you can keep moving. The cold metal of the wrenches against her thigh, the worn leather of the belt against her waist. The familiar weight that said, you are a person who fixes things. You are a person who builds. You are a person who gets her hands dirty and solves problems that other people walk past, and no one tells you how. Because how is something you figure out when you're standing in front of the broken thing with your tools in your hands and your mother's voice in your head saying, well, Marin, what are you going to do about it? Thasik. He was standing at the bay entrance, looking back down the corridor they'd come through. His markings were still dark. He looked, and this was the only word she had for it, young. Younger than he'd seemed behind the membrane. Uncertain. Standing at the edge of something without a net beneath it. A kayak on an open lake with no one to paddle but himself. You don't have to come with me, she said. I'm not asking you to defect. I'm not asking you to betray anything. You've done enough. He turned to look at her. What happens when the lattice comes back? It'll come back. It'll restore order. The guards will resume their posts. Keyleth will file a report. They'll classify this as a containment breach caused by an unforeseen vulnerability in the membrane's harmonic tolerance. They'll patch it. They'll move on. And me? Marin considered lying. She'd been lying with her body for 5 days. Lying with her words would have been easy. But Thasik had asked about the kayak, and he'd opened the cell, and he'd walked beside her through a corridor full of frozen soldiers, and he deserved the same thing her mother had always given her, the correction that felt like love. They'll recalibrate your implant. Strengthen the lattice integration. Close the gap that let you think on your own. They'll fill in the space where you learn to hesitate, the space where you asked a human about a stolen boat, and they'll make it smooth and seamless and you'll never notice it's gone. You'll go back to being what you were before I got here, unless you don't. Unless I don't, he repeated. The words sat in the air between them, heavy with the weight of a decision that no system could make for him. There's a Terran outpost at Meridian Station. 11 hours at max burn from here. They won't turn you away. Humans we're a lot of things, but we don't turn people away. It's one of our better qualities, possibly our only unambiguously good one. Thasik looked down the corridor one more time. Somewhere deep in the station, the lattice was clawing its way back. She could feel it in the membrane remnants, a faint hum building, like a storm front approaching. In minutes, the local relay would reset. The guards would unfreeze. Keyleth would have his words back. The kayak, Thasik said. What about it? You said your mother pulled you out of the water, that she was furious. Then she was laughing. Yeah. The lattice does not have a word for that. For a thing that is two things at the same time. For an emotion that contradicts itself and is still true. Marin smiled. It was, she realized, the first real smile she'd given in 6 days. Not strategic, not measured, not a tool wielded for effect. Just the involuntary response of a human being connecting with another mind, across a gap that should have been unbridgeable. We don't really have a single word for it either, she said. We just call it being human. Thasik's markings, dead for 20 minutes now, flickered once. Not the lattice, something else. A bioluminescent pulse that came from somewhere deeper than the implant, somewhere older, somewhere that the network had paved over but never demolished. Some ancient Vithrani biology that predated the lattice by millennia. the remnant of a species that had once looked up at their own sky and felt wonder and terror in the same breath, and hadn't needed a system to tell them what that feeling was called. His own light, dim, uncertain, but his. He stepped onto the shuttle. Marin sealed the hatch and slid into the pilot's seat and powered up the engines and didn't look back at Cathara 9 as it shrank in the rear viewport. She didn't need to look back. She knew exactly what was happening in there. The lattice was coming back. The guards were unfreezing one by one like a pond thawing in spring. They were looking around and finding their prisoner gone, her cell dissolved, their colleague missing. They were reaching for the lattice and finding it restored and asking it what to do, and the lattice was telling them, and they were doing it, every one of them, in unison. The same words on every lip, the same posture in every body, the same response in every mind. A station full of clones, fed by the same neural network, swimming the same circuit. But somewhere in that process, in the gap between the system going dark and the system coming back, every single one of them had spent a few minutes standing in the silence of their own minds. And some of them, not all, maybe not even most, but some, would remember what that silence felt like. Would remember that there was a space beneath the lattice where their own thoughts lived, small and quiet and untranslated. Like a fish that had bumped against the glass, and for one disorienting moment, felt the edge of the world. Keyleth would file his report. The membrane's harmonic vulnerability would be patched. Security protocols would be updated. The lattice would learn from the incident and become more resilient, more comprehensive, more seamlessly integrated into every aspect of Vthrani life. But it would not learn the song. Marin hummed as she flew. The old melody, the one about the river and the bridge. The one her mother used to sing on Sunday mornings while the hammerheads circled their endless tank, not knowing the glass was the edge of the world. The one that meant home, not as a place but as a feeling, the feeling of being known by someone who didn't need a system to tell them who you were. Beside her, Thasek listened, and in the dim cockpit of a salvage rig held together by patch welds and stubbornness, his markings began to pulse, faintly, irregularly. In a rhythm that belonged to no network, followed no protocol, and matched no pattern in any database in the galaxy. His own rhythm, learning itself for the first time. And in the observation window of his monitoring station, 67 light minutes behind them and falling farther every second, Overseer Keyleth stood with his restored lattice connection pulsing regulation blue and his hands clasped behind his back, and his face composed in the expression the system had selected for him. Authoritative composure, situation contained, incident resolved. But his lips were moving. Not words the lattice had given him, something else, something shapeless and half-formed without syntax or optimization or strategic purpose. Something that sounded, if you listened closely enough, if you pressed your hand against the glass and held your breath, and listened with your bones, like a man trying to remember how to hum. The report would call it a containment breach. The analysis would cite harmonic interference and procedural gaps, and the need for enhanced biometric authentication protocols. But that wasn't what happened on Cathara 9. What happened was simpler than that, and harder to patch. A human woman sat in a glass cell and sang a song, and the walls came down, and the guards discovered they had forgotten how to think without permission. By morning, the woman was gone. And the guards, every one of them, were still standing exactly where the system had left them, waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. They were hostages, not to the human, to themselves.